Welcome to this week's Bible reading and my reflections. This week's reading is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, starting at verse 31. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." I wonder if you can think of a time when you've changed your mind about an issue. I wonder if you've ever said to anyone, "I used to think this, but now I've changed my mind. I used to vote Labour, but at the last election I voted Liberal," or vice versa. "I used to think that the Bible taught that women shouldn't lead churches, but now I've changed how I understand certain texts of the Bible." They're just a couple of examples. Most of us, for most of the time, are actually pretty stuck in our ways, and we hold on to our opinions and our views because we think we're right. We hold on to our views sometimes, despite the evidence, because of our pride or arrogance. We're just sure we must be right. Sometimes we hold on to our views because of fear of what others may think of us if we do change our minds, fear of losing friends, fear of what changing our minds might do to our own self-esteem. Admitting we were wrong can be an act of humility, and humility isn't well thought of in our world. When it comes to our views and opinions of God, not many people would claim to have a complete knowledge and understanding of him and his ways, even though some groups act like they do and treat others with different views with disdain. So when it comes to God, we would do well not to hang on doggedly to our views, because some of them may be wrong, or some may need adjusting in the light of what God reveals to us as time passes. How can we grow in our faith and knowledge of God if we just hang on to what we know at this moment? In our Bible reading, you've got to feel sorry for Peter. He's come so far. He's left his fishing nets to follow Jesus. He's doing way better than the religious leaders and recognized religious experts, many of whom show outright hostility to Jesus. Peter's seen Jesus heal people. He's heard Jesus teach. And despite how the leaders of his faith, people who have power and expertise in the scriptures, despite how they are reacting to Jesus, Peter is able to say to him that he believes that he is the long-awaited Messiah. Peter hasn't been put off, as the religious leaders have, by Jesus flouting the traditions, the religious traditions. But what Peter can't do is junk all that he has been brought up to understand about the Messiah. And that's not surprising, is it? The predominant view at the time about the Messiah was that he would be King David's true heir. King David, a king chosen and anointed by God, was their national hero. Under his rule, the Israelites defeated their enemies and thrived. Their Messiah would be a second King David, but greater. He would bring in a golden age for God's people. Some were expecting the Messiah to bring about a decisive military defeat of Israel's enemies. Others were expecting him to rebuild or cleanse the temple. The Dead Sea Scrolls, with writing from the 2nd century BC to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, speak of two messiahs, one a king and the other a priest. Peter, before today's reading, has taken a huge step of faith. You are the Messiah, he has just said to Jesus. And then Jesus, and I'm quoting Mark here, the gospel writer, began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus uses the title Son of Man as an alternative title for the Messiah. In Peter's mind, this makes no sense. It's either or. Either Jesus is a Messiah, or he's going to be rejected by the religious leaders and be put to death. Jesus can't be the Messiah and be rejected by the religious leaders and put to death. I'm not sure what Peter would have made of Jesus's words, after 3 days rise again. I imagine that they just passed him by because he's so confused by what Jesus is saying. So it's no wonder that Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. And I imagine him saying something like this: "Don't be daft. You've just told us that you're the Messiah, so of course you're not going to be put to death by the religious leaders. Snap out of that negative talk. How can that happen to you when you're the Messiah? That's not the way of the Messiah." All of Jesus's disciples must have been thinking the same as Peter, but it's Peter, the one who wears his heart on his sleeve, who speaks to Jesus and rebukes him. And then Jesus speaks to him harshly, really harshly. "Get behind me, Satan." What Jesus hears in Peter's words is the voice of the tempter, the devil, Satan, the same voice that Jesus had heard in the desert. Don't be the sort of Messiah that will result in your crucifixion. Be a miracle worker. Be someone who attracts the crowds. Rule the world by doing things my way. Don't be the sort of Messiah that your Father in heaven wants you to be. Be the one the people are wanting, the one the people are expecting. Jesus needs to quieten that voice immediately and forcefully. Peter would have had no idea that his rebuke of Jesus was so contrary to the will of God. But Jesus tells him, "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of humans." And I want to say to Jesus, yes, that's because Peter is human. How hard it is for us to have in mind the things of God, to see things as God sees them. Some verses from Isaiah come to mind. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." We sometimes hear Christians speak with such seeming authority about what is right and condemning other Christians. And I wonder whether they do in fact know the mind of God on what they are speaking about, or whether they would have the humility to ever say, I don't know what the mind of God is on this matter, or I got it wrong in the past. Perhaps some of us are more sure of our position on various contentious subjects than we ought to be. Jesus allows Peter to slip back in amongst the crowd to hear some more teaching that would have been so hard for everyone to hear. Having got his picture of the Messiah so wrong, of course, his picture of what it would mean to follow the Messiah would be wrong. That too needs recasting. Jesus tells Peter and the others that they need to banish from their minds pictures of earthly power, of triumphal military parades, or of a shining new splendid temple. Many of us are familiar with the words of Jesus's teaching about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, about the need to take up our crosses and to follow Jesus. This is how Eugene Peterson translates Jesus's teaching in his version of the Bible, the Message, with some phrases also added by me. Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me, and I'll show you how. Don't spend so much time attending to your physical well-being and comfort. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to saving yourself, your true self, your soul. What good would it do to get everything you want and lose you, the real you, to lose your soul? What is more important than your soul? What could you ever trade your soul for? If any of you are embarrassed over me and the way I'm leading you when you get around your fickle and unfocused friends, know that you'll be an even greater embarrassment to the Son of Man when he arrives in all the splendor of God his Father with an army of holy angels. How would Peter have received this teaching of Jesus? His mind must have been in turmoil. His ideas about the Messiah have been turned on their head, and now his own future as a follower or disciple of Jesus is looking very different to how he must have been imagining it. It would be like us applying for a job as a dog carer. We know what's involved. We can picture ourselves feeding the dogs and taking them to their local park a couple of times a day. And then we turn up at the owner's house to find out that the dog owners are Antarctic explorers. The dogs are huskies, and you are expected to be the dog carer as they, with the dogs pulling the baggage, and you trek to the South Pole. You'd need some time to think about whether you'd want to be dog carers in those circumstances, wouldn't you? It's a very different proposition to the one you had envisaged. So it must have been for Peter. He surely needed time to evaluate his commitment to Jesus. Perhaps he was tempted to leave Jesus and to return to fishing. Perhaps we're tempted sometimes to leave Jesus or follow a Jesus of our own design rather than the real one. Or perhaps we're tempted to leave a particular church to find one that presents less challenges to us or demands less from us. After Jesus's teaching, there's a pause in the gospel writer Mark's narrative. We have a 6-day gap. I wonder if Peter returned to his hometown of Capernaum in Galilee. When Peter told Jesus that he believed he was the Messiah, when Jesus began teaching them what sort of Messiah he was and what it would mean for people to be his followers, they were in another region, a semi-pagan area, an area where those of different religions lived, near the Roman town of Caesarea Philippi. It was actually quite a long way from Peter's hometown of Capernaum, about 60 kilometers. After 6 days, I wonder if you know what happened next. We read that Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and Jesus was transfigured. His divinity was revealed. Peter had 6 days of wrestling and questioning. What have I signed up to? Who is this man I've decided to follow? And now this revelation. Jesus's transfiguration wouldn't have answered all the questions that Peter would have had. I don't think it would have put his mind at ease. In fact, it would have been deeply troubling and surely would have raised more questions in his mind. How come the one who I've now seen as God is still talking about himself being put to death? How come he is happy to be recognized by me as the Messiah, but is still talking about being rejected by the religious leaders? But now, having seen this revelation, this transfiguration, I imagine Peter felt compelled to follow Jesus, despite his questions and his inability to make sense of it all. Our journey of faith, too, can leave us for a while with more questions than answers. The more we dig deep, the more we get to know Jesus and his teachings. So last week, we thought about God the Father speaking to us these words: "You are my child whom I love. With you I am well pleased." His love for us and pleasure in us is unearned. Then today we have Jesus say that we need to take up our crosses and follow him. He challenges us to live a life that is hard, a life that requires sacrifice and effort, one where we're told to love our enemies as well as to take up our crosses. So is the Christian life one of struggle and striving, trying to live up to the near impossible standards that Jesus teaches? Or is it a life of receiving God's love, his forgiveness, his peace, and handing our burdens to him so that he can give us rest? I wonder how you'd answer that. Do we, like Peter, need to let go of what we thought about God and move forward into new understanding? Do we, like Peter, need to let go of what we thought being a follower of Jesus or Christian was all about and move forward into a new way of living our Christian lives? I conclude today by reading a poem by the Christian poet Stuart Henderson. I don't want a splintered Messiah in a sweat-stained, greasy grey robe. I want a new one. I couldn't take this one to parties. People would say, "Who's your friend?" I'd give an embarrassed giggle and change the subject. If I took him home, I'd have to bandage his hands. The neighbour would think he's a football hooligan. I don't want his cross in the hall. It doesn't go with the wallpaper. I don't want him standing there like a sad ballet dancer with holes in his tights. I want a different Messiah, streamlined and inoffensive. I want one from a catalogue who's as quiet as a monastery. I want a package tour Messiah, not one who takes me to Golgotha. I want a king of kings with blow-waves in his hair. I don't want the true Christ. I want a false one. May God bless you. Amen.